An undercover billionaire poses as a waiter to meet his daughter's boyfriend, but what happened next will shock you. The sun was setting over the busy streets of New York City. Inside a fancy restaurant called La Belle, people were laughing, eating, and chatting over delicious food. The place was full of expensive decorations and looked like something out of a dream. In the middle of it all, Robert Sinclair stood wearing a waiter's uniform. This was strange because Robert wasn't a waiter. He was a billionaire, a powerful man who owned many companies. But tonight he wasn't here as a businessman. He had a plan. Robert's daughter, Amelia, was everything to him. She was kind, smart, and full of life. But recently she had started dating a man named Jason, and Robert didn't trust him. Jason didn't come from a rich family. He lived in a small apartment and worked a regular job. Amelia said that's what made him special. "He doesn't care about money, Dad. He loves me for me," she told Robert with a big smile. But Robert couldn't stop worrying. Was Jason hiding something? Did he really love Amelia, or was he just after the family fortune? Robert needed to find out, so when he heard they were having dinner at La Belle, he decided to go undercover. He paid the restaurant to let him pretend to be a waiter for the night. The restaurant buzzed with energy. People clinked glasses and laughed softly, the sound mixing with the music of a live violinist. Robert carefully carried a tray of drinks, walking past the fancy tables. Then he saw them, Amelia and Jason. Amelia looked beautiful, wearing a simple but elegant dress. Her smile lit up the whole room. Jason sat across from her, dressed in a clean blazer. He leaned in as she talked, giving her his full attention. Robert walked up to their table, keeping his head low. "Good evening," he said in a calm voice. "Would you like some wine?" Amelia barely noticed him, too busy talking to Jason about her art show. But Jason looked up. His brown eyes were warm, and he nodded politely. "No thanks, we're good." Robert stepped away, pretending to focus on his work, but his eyes stayed on them. Jason seemed polite. So far, he hadn't done anything suspicious, but Robert wasn't ready to relax. For most of the dinner, things seemed normal. Amelia laughed a lot, and Jason listened to her with a gentle smile. They looked happy, which made Robert feel a little guilty for spying. Maybe he was wrong about Jason. But then, something strange happened. A tall man in a black jacket walked over to Jason. He bent down and whispered something in his ear. Jason's smile disappeared. His face turned serious. "You need to leave," Jason said quietly. The man shook his head. "You can't run forever, Jason." Amelia noticed the change. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. Jason forced a smile. "Yeah, it's fine. Just someone I used to know." Then he stood up and said to the man, "Let's talk outside." Robert's heart raced. Who was this man? What did he want with Jason? Jason and the man walked toward the back of the restaurant. Robert set down his tray and quickly followed them, slipping out through the kitchen door. Outside, the alley was dark and quiet, except for the hum of distant traffic. Jason faced the man under a flickering streetlight. "I told you, I'm done with all of this," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. The man laughed coldly. "You think it's that easy? You still owe us. Pay up, or your little girlfriend might find out who you really are." Jason stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Leave her out of this." The man smirked, but finally backed away. "You better think about what I said," he warned before walking off into the shadows. Robert stayed hidden behind a stack of boxes, his mind racing. What was Jason hiding? Who did he owe money to? And why hadn't he told Amelia about it? When Jason went back inside, his calm expression had returned, as if nothing had happened. He smiled at Amelia and picked up their conversation where they'd left off. She had no idea what had just happened. But Robert couldn't ignore what he'd seen. Jason was clearly hiding something, and it seemed serious. Robert's mission wasn't over. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. As the evening went on, Robert's mind kept turning. This wasn't just about protecting Amelia from a bad boyfriend. Whatever Jason was involved in seemed dangerous, and if Amelia was caught in the middle of it, Robert would never forgive himself. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The next morning, Robert found himself back at the restaurant, slipping into the same waiter's uniform as the night before. The restaurant had a quieter vibe during breakfast hours, just a few early risers sipping coffee or nibbling on croissants. It didn't take long for Robert to spot Jason. He was seated at a corner table, staring into his coffee like it held the answers to all his problems. His shoulders were hunched, and his usually confident demeanor seemed replaced by something heavier, something vulnerable. Robert grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and made his way to Jason's table. He poured silently at first, his eyes scanning the young man's face. Jason looked up, startled before offering a faint smile. "You again," Jason said, his voice carrying a hint of recognition. "Back for another shift," Robert replied smoothly, keeping his tone light. "Looks like you've got a lot on your mind this morning." Jason chuckled, but it was hollow. "Yeah, you could say that." Robert took the opportunity to slide into the seat across from him, setting the coffee pot down. Jason raised an eyebrow, but he didn't protest. "I've seen that look before," Robert said, leaning back slightly. "The one you've got. Like the weight of the world's on your shoulders." Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "What can I say? Life doesn't always play fair." Robert nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Sometimes talking about it helps." Jason hesitated, his fingers tapping the side of his mug. Finally, he said, "I don't even know why I'm telling you this, but I've got some people after me. Loan sharks, to be exact. I owe them more than I can pay, and they're not exactly the forgiving type." The admission was quiet, almost like Jason was ashamed to say it out loud. Robert felt a twinge of something unexpected, sympathy. Still, he kept his tone measured. "That sounds rough. How'd you get into that mess?" Jason gave a bitter laugh. "When my parents died, I had to drop everything to take care of my younger brother and sister. There wasn't enough money to go around, so I borrowed from the wrong people. It was supposed to be temporary, just enough to get us by." He shook his head. "But once you're in, it's nearly impossible to get out." Robert listened intently, his usual sharpness replaced with genuine interest. Jason continued, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've been working nonstop to pay them back. Every extra dollar I make goes straight to them, but the interest keeps piling up. No matter what I do, it's never enough." "Why haven't you told your girlfriend?" Robert asked carefully, his tone softening at the mention of his daughter. Jason's jaw tightened. "Because she deserves better than this, better than me dragging her into my problems." For a moment, Robert stayed silent, his mind processing everything Jason had just said. He had expected deceit, maybe even manipulation, but instead he found a man trying to protect the woman he loved, even at great personal cost. Finally, Robert leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "You're a good man, Jason, but there's something you need to know about me." Jason frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "I'm not just some waiter," Robert said, his voice steady but firm. "My name is Robert Sinclair. I'm Amelia's father." Jason froze, his face draining of color. "You're her dad?" Robert nodded, keeping his gaze locked on Jason, "and I went undercover to see what kind of man my daughter was dating. I wanted to make sure she was safe." Jason sat back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "So all of this, last night, today, was some kind of test." "It was," Robert admitted. "But now I understand what you're dealing with, and I think we can fix this, if you're willing to accept my help." Jason stared at Robert, his pride warring with his desperation. After a long pause, he exhaled and nodded. "I don't know how, but I'll do whatever it takes. For Amelia." Robert stood, placing a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. For her." As Robert walked away, Jason sat in stunned silence, the weight of his problems suddenly feeling a little lighter. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. After leaving the restaurant, Robert returned to his office, his mind racing. Jason's story had given him clarity, not only about the kind of man his daughter had chosen, but also about the danger that loomed over their lives. The loan sharks were a serious threat, and Jason, for all his determination, couldn't face them alone. Robert wasn't just a man with money, he was a man with power and connections. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he knew how to handle people who played dirty. If these loan sharks thought they could push Jason around, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The first thing Robert did was call his trusted private investigator, Frank. The grizzled PI had worked for Robert for years, digging into business rivals, shady deals, and anything else that threatened the Sinclair name. "I need everything you can find on a group of loan sharks operating near Queens," Robert said, his tone clipped. "Specifically, the ones dealing with Jason McAllister." Frank didn't hesitate. "Got it. I'll have a report for you in a few hours." Robert hung up and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. He wasn't just thinking about Jason now. He was thinking about Amelia. She had always been his priority, his reason for pushing so hard in life. Now the thought of her getting caught in Jason's mess made his chest tighten with worry. Later that afternoon, Robert's black sedan pulled up outside Jason's modest apartment building. Jason was waiting on the curb, looking nervous but determined. He had changed into a plain button-up shirt and jeans, and his hair was slightly mussed, as though he hadn't slept well. Robert stepped out of the car, his usual commanding presence making Jason stand a little straighter. Without a word, Robert gestured for Jason to get in. The ride was quiet at first, the tension in the air almost tangible. Finally, Jason broke the silence. "Where are we going?" "To see the people you owe money to," Robert replied calmly. Jason's head whipped around, his eyes wide. "What? Are you crazy? You can't just—" "I can," Robert interrupted, his voice firm. "And I will. You want to protect Amelia? Then trust me to handle this." Jason swallowed hard but said nothing more. The car pulled into the parking lot of a dingy warehouse on the edge of the city. The place reeked of rust and oil, and the faint sound of machinery echoed in the distance. Jason's hands were clenched into fists as they stepped inside. 3 men were waiting for them, their faces hard and unfriendly. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned against a table, his arms crossed. Well, the scared man drawled. "Look who finally showed up." His eyes flicked to Robert, and he smirked. "And who's this? Your lawyer?" "Not quite," Robert said smoothly, stepping forward. "My name is Robert Sinclair. Perhaps you've heard of me." The smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of recognition. "Sinclair? The billionaire?" "That's right." Robert's tone remained calm, but his eyes were cold. "And I'm here to settle this debt." The scared man's confidence wavered. He glanced at his companions, then back at Robert. "This isn't your fight. Jason owes us. He borrowed, and now it's time to pay." Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Tell me the amount." The man sneered, regaining some of his swagger. "With interest?" $150 grand. Robert calmly wrote out the check and handed it over. The man snatched it, his eyes narrowing. "This doesn't mean we forget." Robert's gaze turned steely. "It means you take the money and leave Jason and my family alone. Permanently. If I hear otherwise, I'll make sure you regret it." The room fell silent. Robert's voice carried the weight of someone who was used to being obeyed. The scared man hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. As they walked back to the car, Jason let out a shaky breath. "I can't believe you just did that." Robert glanced at him. "You wanted to protect Amelia. So do I. This was the only way." Jason's expression was a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You'll repay me by being honest with her," Robert said firmly. "No more secrets. If you're going to be part of her life, you need to start acting like it." Jason nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I will, I promise." That evening, Jason and Amelia sat together in the cozy living room of her apartment. Amelia's face was pale as Jason explained everything: the debt, the loan sharks, and how her father had stepped in to help. By the time he finished, tears shimmered in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason looked down at his hands. "I was scared, Amelia. Scared you'd think I wasn't good enough for you." Amelia reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. We're a team, Jason. But no more secrets, okay?" Jason nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Watching from the doorway, Robert felt a rare sense of peace. He had seen enough. Jason wasn't perfect, but he was willing to fight for Amelia. And that was enough for Robert to give him a chance. As he stepped into the room, Amelia looked up and smiled. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly. Robert nodded, his voice gentle. "I just want you to be happy." And for the first time in a long while, he believed she truly was. The events of the last few days had left Jason, Amelia, and Robert emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. With the debt resolved and the loan sharks gone, Jason could finally breathe again. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a real chance to move forward, not just for himself, but for Amelia. But Robert wasn't done just yet. He had one last lesson to impart, not as a billionaire, but as a father. A week after the confrontation with the loan sharks, Jason received a call from Robert. His voice, as always, was calm and composed. "I'd like you to join me for a meeting tomorrow morning," Robert said. "It's important." Jason hesitated, wondering what Robert had planned this time. A meeting? What kind of meeting? "You'll see," Robert replied cryptically. "Be at my office at 9 a.m. sharp." The next morning, Jason arrived at the Sinclair Enterprises building, feeling more out of place than ever. The sleek glass skyscraper loomed above him, a symbol of power and wealth that felt worlds away from his modest life. Robert greeted Jason in the lobby, dressed sharply in one of his signature tailored suits. Without much explanation, he led Jason to a conference room on the top floor. Inside, a group of executives sat around a polished table, their faces serious but intrigued. Robert gestured for Jason to sit beside him. "This," Robert began, addressing the room, "is Jason McAllister. He's someone I respect, not for his wealth, but for his resilience and integrity. Today we're here to discuss an opportunity that could change his life." Jason blinked, stunned. "Wait, what?" Robert turned to him, a rare smile softening his usual stern expression. "You've spent years working hard, taking care of your family, and facing challenges most people would crumble under. You have potential, Jason, and I want to help you reach it." The meeting wasn't just a discussion, it was a stepping stone. Robert had arranged for Jason to join a mentorship program at Sinclair Enterprises. It wasn't charity, it was a chance for Jason to prove himself, to grow his skills, and to build a career on solid ground. Jason hesitated, overwhelmed by the offer. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like this." Robert's gaze was steady. "You are. But the question is, are you willing to take the chance?" After a long moment, Jason nodded. "Yes, I am." The day wasn't just about Jason's future. It was also about the relationship between Robert and Amelia. That evening, the three of them shared a quiet dinner at Robert's penthouse, a first for Jason. Amelia was radiant, her happiness almost tangible as she sat between the two most important men in her life. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to bridge a gap between them. As dessert was served, Robert cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "There's something I've learned over the years," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Wealth and power mean nothing if you don't have people you can trust and care for. Jason, you've proven that you're willing to do whatever it takes to protect my daughter. And for that, you have my respect." Jason nodded, his voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you. That means a lot." In the weeks that followed, Jason embraced his new opportunity with determination. He threw himself into the mentorship program, proving that Robert's faith in him hadn't been misplaced. His relationship with Amelia grew stronger as well, built on a foundation of honesty and trust. For Robert, watching the two of them together brought a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He had spent so much of his life protecting Amelia that he hadn't realized she didn't need his protection anymore, she just needed his support. Months later, the three of them sat around a small table at La Belle, sharing a meal together. This time, there were no disguises, no hidden motives, just laughter and warmth. Jason raised his glass, his expression earnest. "To family," he said, glancing at both Robert and Amelia. Robert raised his own glass, a rare smile crossing his face. "To family." As they clinked glasses, the weight of the past finally lifted. They weren't perfect, but they were a family, and that was enough.